The train ride to the Hamptons for Christmas Eve had been exceptionally quiet. I chose a window seat on the Long Island Railroad, watching the gray city skyline dissolve into coastal brush, while other passengers scrolled through their phones. It was not a glamorous entrance, but it served my purposes perfectly. Stepping off the platform, the Atlantic wind was freezing, biting through my practical coat as I stood alone. High on the hill, my family watched from behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of a mansion I secretly saved from foreclosure. My simplicity was the perfect camouflage for my $5.2 billion empire. I had spent millions on elite PR firms and legal barricades to keep my name off the Forbes 400 list, hiding my identity behind a complex web of anonymous holding companies that no Hamptons socialite would ever think to investigate. Sitting here with my coffee, watching the world drift by, it makes me realize how much we all hide behind our own camouflage. Where are you watching from today, and what time is it there? I'm looking forward to your comments. Now, let me tell you what happened when I pushed open those heavy doors. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the estate, and the scent of expensive pine needles and subtle judgment immediately filled my lungs. Stephanie stood in the foyer, her diamonds catching the light of a chandelier I had quietly paid for last spring. She didn't offer a hug. Instead, she checked her watch, her mouth thin and tight. She asked if the train had run late, mentioning how notoriously unreliable public transportation is for someone of my age. Behind her, Kevin emerged from the study with a glass of scotch that cost more than my train ticket. He called me the perpetual transit rider, laughing, as if it were a joke we both shared. I didn't laugh. I just set my bag down and watched the waitstaff in their crisp white gloves move through the living room like ghosts. Claire was already there, leaning against the marble countertop with a glass of vintage champagne. She didn't look up from her phone until I was 3 feet away. She asked if I'd seen her new hyper-electric vehicle in the driveway. $260,000, she bragged, describing the custom leather interior as if it were a high-ranking achievement. She whispered to Kevin that I was probably too proud to admit I couldn't afford anything better than a monthly rail pass. I listened to them discuss the 5-star gala they'd organized for the evening with a private catering team and a string quartet. They acted as if this lifestyle was a natural birthright, never questioning why the bank had stopped sending foreclosure notices 3 years ago. The house was alive with the Hamptons elite, everyone perfectly styled and perfectly shallow. Kevin announced to a group of investors that I was the family's resident drifter, still playing around with my little logistics thing while real life passed me by. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I realized that my presence here was merely a prop to make their conventional success look more vibrant. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for far too long. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and now the account was empty. I excused myself and walked into the quiet of the back hallway. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why they chose to be this way. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the Apex Global Treasury application. It was a cold, digital interface, nothing but facts and numbers. I navigated to the Heritage Maintenance Fund. This account covered the private security detail, the master chefs in the kitchen, and the entire waitstaff currently serving appetizers to 300 guests. For 3 years, I had kept this house running on a subscription model, and I was the only one footing the bill. I didn't hesitate. With one sharp tap, I switched the fund status to inactive. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet adjustment. I stood there in the silence, watching the screen glow. I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of those walls. Every staff member in that house received a synchronized notification on their mobile devices, a formal notice of payment suspension, effective immediately. I heard the muffled sound of a silver tray hitting the floor. Then the music stopped. I walked back into the living room just in time to see the head chef taking off his apron. He didn't say a word to my parents. He just gestured to his team. 20 servers and 4 world-class cooks began to systematically pack their knives and head for the exit. The gala guests stood frozen, glasses half full, as the help simply vanished. Stephanie began to shriek, demanding to know what was happening, while Kevin stood in the center of a half-finished party, looking at a room that had suddenly grown very quiet and very cold. They weren't shocked by what they'd done to me, they were just shocked that I'd stopped playing along. I watched the chaos unfold with a clinical detachment, my mind already drifting back across the 8 years I had spent in the shadows. While Claire was busy cultivating a social media following, and my parents were perfecting their Hamptons socialite act, I was deep in the trenches of the logistics world. I started with a $500,000 seed investment from a secret trust they never bothered to ask about. I took that modest beginning and built Apex Global Logistics into a $5.2 billion empire, one late-night warehouse audit and one high-stakes tarmac deal at a time. They saw a drifter with a logistical hobby, but I saw a global fulfillment network that served the most powerful corporations on the planet. I spent my 20s in drafty airport hangars and cold offices, while they spent their time at country club dinners mocking my lack of a car. I didn't correct them. I never corrected them. Their constant dismissal was not a burden. It was my greatest tactical advantage. This was the invisible chain of the survivor. By allowing my family to view me as a failure, I had unknowingly bought myself the ultimate luxury: privacy. I was building a fortress, a financial stronghold where no one was looking for me. If they had known I was thriving, they would have tried to occupy my world. They would have demanded board seats, siphoned off my profits for their vanity projects, and suffocated my vision with their entitlement. Instead, I wore their insults like armor. Every time Kevin laughed at my train fare, I authorized an international acquisition. Every time Stephanie suggested I move into the servants' quarters to save on rent, I expanded our executive fleet into a new country. I realized that my family's version of love had always been a subscription, one where I was expected to pay the bill with my own dignity. I had been the silent investor in their perfect image for years, but the investment had never yielded a return. I realized that an empty heart cannot be filled by an inherited name, and I had finally stopped trying to earn a place at a table that was built on my own stolen labor. I didn't need their validation to be powerful. I had spent 8 years building my own sky, and I had done it so quietly that they never noticed the ground was shifting beneath their feet. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a long overdue accounting. The house grew noticeably colder as the night air began to leak through the foyer, the heat having been one of the first systems to stutter after I deactivated the central fund. Kevin stood in the center of the living room, ignoring the half-eaten appetizers and the abandoned drink trays that littered the marble tables. He tapped a crystal glass with a silver spoon, demanding the attention of the remaining 50 guests who had stayed to witness the unfolding drama. Stephanie stood beside him, her practiced socialite smile now a thin mask of desperation. They began their announcement with the phrase that had been the anthem of my life: family comes first. They told everyone, in hushed tones of false concern, that due to my continued financial instability and my failing shipping hobby, they had no choice but to take control of my future. They announced to the entire Hamptons elite that they were liquidating my remaining shares in the Legacy Trust to cover the mounting debts of the estate and to support Claire's career. They framed it as a mercy, as if they were doing me a favor by removing the burden of assets I was clearly too incompetent to manage. Claire stepped forward then, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of greed and undisguised triumph. She spoke loudly about her new vice presidency at Sterling & Cross, the marketing firm she'd been bragging about all evening. She boasted about her 6-figure salary and the corner office she would be moving into next month, calling it the start of a new era for the family name. She looked at me and suggested, with a sharp edge of condescension, that perhaps I could find a place as her personal assistant once my little logistics business finally went under. I stood in the corner of the room, leaning against a cold radiator, watching the performance with a clinical eye. I knew that Sterling & Cross was currently $30 million in debt. I knew their board had been begging for a bailout for over 6 months, and I knew that Apex Global had finalized the acquisition of that very firm just 2 hours ago. I was the one who had authorized the deep dive audit that would eventually expose every inflated metric Claire had used to secure her promotion. The public humiliation was meant to be the final strike against my dignity, but to me, it was just another data point on a sinking graph. My mother turned to me, her voice ringing out so every guest could hear, and told me I should be grateful they were using my worthless shares for something useful for once. She didn't see me as a daughter. She saw me as a resource to be harvested for Claire's benefit. I looked at the guests, the same circle of people who had spent years looking through me as if I were part of the architecture. They nodded in agreement, pitying the daughter who didn't fit the mold of Hampton's success. This wasn't a family gathering. It was a transactional liquidation of character. I felt a calm settle over me, the kind of stillness that comes right before a major structural collapse. They had spent years counting Claire's cars and my train rides, but they had never bothered to count the cost of their own cruelty. The family account was officially overdrawn, and I was no longer covering the deficit. My phone buzzed again, this time with a priority alert from my vice president of acquisitions. The deal was done. Apex Global Logistics had officially acquired Sterling & Cross, the marketing firm where Claire thought she was a rising star. I watched her from across the room, laughing with a group of socialites, and felt absolutely nothing. I opened the internal management portal and authorized a full restructuring of her department. I signed the termination order for her position myself, effective immediately. It wasn't a malicious act. It was a necessary liquidation of redundant and incompetent assets. But the most devastating data arrived in the next encrypted attachment. My private legal team had completed the audit of my diverted dividends funds I had secretly funneled into the family accounts to keep this estate running. I discovered a $5 million discrepancy. Kevin had forged my signature on dozens of documents to siphon that money into his personal accounts over the last 3 years. He hadn't just been a bad businessman, he was a criminal, stealing from the daughter he publicly called a failure. I had even quietly neutralized the red flags at the IRS for 3 years, directing my personal accountants to bury his discrepancies, just to ensure he didn't trigger a federal audit before I was ready to deliver my own version of justice. I stood there in the cold silence of the hallway, realizing the depth of the illusion. My parents and my sister weren't actually part of the elite world they inhabited. They were merely renting their importance with my stolen labor. This was the ultimate realization of the illusion of power in an empty wallet. When you have no internal character, you have to steal the external appearance of success just to survive. Their entire Hamptons identity was a subscription they could no longer afford. I rubbed my eyes, feeling a sudden, sharp clarity. This wasn't a family breakdown anymore. It was a forensic accounting of a long-term fraud. Kevin and Stephanie had spent years convincing the world I was invisible while using my wealth to shine. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along, but they were about to be even more shocked when the legal bill finally arrived. Calm, factual, and lethal, those were the only tools I had left. Inside, my screen glowed with a different kind of sunrise. One made of facts and quiet retribution. Kevin marched toward me, his face contorted with a mixture of Scotch-fueled rage and wounded pride. He told me that I had embarrassed the family for the last time in front of his peers, and he ordered me to get out of his house immediately. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I simply looked at my watch and noted that there were exactly 2 minutes remaining on the schedule. I told him that I wasn't going anywhere just yet, but he was welcome to try and move me. The ground began to vibrate then, a low-frequency hum that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the estate. The guests paused, their eyes darting to the ceiling as the crystal chandeliers began to chime against one another. Stephanie gripped Kevin's arm, asking if it was an earthquake, but the sound was too rhythmic, too intentional. It was the sound of a $5.2 billion truth finally arriving for dinner. 3 sleek, matte black, heavy-lift helicopters crested the tree line in perfect formation, their rotors whipping the manicured lawn into a frenzy. They were predatory machines, worth $13 million each, and they were descending directly toward the private garden. The massive downdraft sent the designer floral arrangements and silk tablecloths flying into the infinity pool, turning the perfect gala into a debris field in seconds. Stephanie began to scream about the noise and the neighbors, but I silenced her with a single look. My legal team already cleared the flight path with local aviation authorities and wired the maximum noise ordinance fines to the town clerk. In the Hamptons, peace and quiet are for sale, and I simply outbid you for the right to be loud. I don't like being interrupted by local authorities when I'm conducting a corporate takeover. The first helicopter touched down with military precision, followed immediately by the other two. The rotors began to wind down, and the heavy sliding doors opened. Captain Rodriguez stepped out onto the grass, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable. He ignored the stunned socialites and the cowering board members, marching straight across the ruined lawn to stand before me. He snapped a salute and announced that the fleet had been delivered as requested, and all systems were operational. I returned the salute casually and turned to face my family. Kevin's mouth hung open, his face the color of old parchment as he stared at the Apex Global insignia on the aircraft. I reached into my bag and pulled out 2 sets of legal documents. I handed the first to Claire, the formal termination of her vice presidency at the firm I now owned. I handed the second to Kevin, the $5 million forgery audit, and the foreclosure notice from Apex Global Properties. Kevin, don't look at me with that pathetic defiance. I have the forensic evidence of your forgery. In New York, that's a felony minimum 10 years in federal prison. I've purchased this debt from the bank, which means I am now the sole victim of your crime. If you leave now and sign the waiver never to contact me again, I'll keep the FBI out of this. My mercy has a price, and that price is your total disappearance from my life. I informed them that they had been right about one thing. I wasn't just a logistics assistant. I was the landlord who had been subsidizing their lives for 3 years, and the lease on their arrogance had just expired. The silence that followed my announcement was heavier than the freezing Atlantic wind. The Hamptons elite, those who had spent the evening whispering about my drifting lifestyle, began to retreat toward the driveway, avoiding eye contact as they passed the black helicopters idling on the lawn. Stephanie collapsed into one of the damp, expensive patio chairs, her face a mask of ruined makeup and genuine terror. She reached for my hand, her voice cracking as she pleaded for me to think about the family name. Kevin stood beside her, the foreclosure notice trembling in his grip, his earlier Scotch-fueled bravado replaced by the hollow stare of a man who finally realized his throne was built on a foundation of air. I looked at them both and felt no surge of triumph, only the cold finality of a completed audit. You think you still own this sanctuary? No. This mansion has been owned by my holding company for 3 years. You've been living here as guests under a $0 lease agreement that you signed without reading. But here is the eviction order, already signed by a Suffolk County judge. You violated the maintenance and financial fraud clauses. The sheriff will be here in 30 minutes to enforce it. You have exactly 30 days to move your personal belongings, but the locks are being changed the moment I step on that helicopter. I'm not a monster, Kevin. I won't have the sheriff drag you into the snow on Christmas Eve. You have until exactly 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. At 8:01, the locks will be changed, and anyone still inside will be treated as a trespasser. I told them that the house they had treated as a fortress of their superiority was already sold to a local coastal conservation group. Within a month, this mansion would no longer be a monument to their vanity. It would be repurposed as a research station for the very environment they had ignored while counting their cars. Claire finally found her voice, though it was small and fragile. She asked how I could be so heartless as to put my own sister on the street, especially after losing her job. I didn't remind her that she had spent the last 8 years trying to bury me in the shadow of her hyper-electric vehicle. I simply told her that I wasn't putting her on the street. I was giving her the same thing they had given me for a decade, the opportunity to find her own way without a handout. I handed her a single train ticket back to the city, one-way, coach class. I told her that if she was as polished and successful as she claimed, she wouldn't need anything more to start over. As the crew began to load the remaining gala catering, every five-star turkey and dish I had paid for into the transport helicopter, I felt no guilt. Reclaiming these resources wasn't about the food, it was about the finality of closing a table where I was never truly welcomed. Captain Rodriguez held the door open, his steady presence a stark contrast to the emotional volatility behind me. Before I boarded, I signed the final digital authorization to establish the Eleanor Apex Scholarship. I decided to take the $5 million that Kevin had forged and siphoned, and instead of just taking it back, I turned it into a permanent endowment for students of merit who, like me, were starting with nothing but a dream and the willingness to work in the dark. This was the justice of the sower. I realized that the best revenge isn't the fire that burns the bridge, but the light that illuminates the new path you built alone. My family had focused on the justice of punishment, worrying about who owned which car and who sat at which table. But I had chosen a higher form of victory. By building an empire that functioned regardless of their approval, I had made their mockery entirely irrelevant. Their insults hadn't been a wall. They had been the runway I used to take flight. I climbed into the helicopter and felt the familiar vibration of the engines powering up. As we lifted off, I watched the Hamptons lights shrink into tiny, insignificant sparks below us. I saw the mansion, my parents' house, that was never truly theirs, growing smaller until it was just one more roof among thousands. I looked out at the dark horizon and realized that for the first time in 31 years, the invisible chains were gone. I wasn't the disappointing daughter or the drifter anymore. I was simply Isabella, and the sky was finally my own. Sitting in the cabin as we headed toward the coast, I found myself thinking about all of you. I've come to realize that many of us are living a story like this right now. If you find yourself in a similar situation, being mocked for your practical choices or labeled a failure because you don't perform success on someone else's terms, I want you to remember something important. Forgiveness isn't always about letting the other person back in. Sometimes it's about balancing the books and setting yourself free from the debt of their expectations. This is my letter to those of you who have always felt at the edge of your own family. You aren't invisible because you lack value. You are invisible because you are building something too big for people with small minds to see. Don't waste your energy trying to convince them of your worth. Let them keep counting their cars and their titles while you keep building your fortress in silence. One day, they will look up and realize that while they were busy guarding a gilded cage, you are already owning the sky. You have the power to redefine your own legacy. It doesn't belong to the people who share your DNA. It belongs to the people who actually see you. Success isn't a performance. It's a reality that doesn't need an audience to be true. So keep working. Keep grinding in the dark. And when the time is right, don't just stand up for yourself, take flight. Don't just survive their underestimation, use it as a runway to take off. If you're building your own sky in silence right now, hit that subscribe button and join our community of those who choose purpose over performance. We'd love to hear your story of winning without a spotlight.